Isabella chooses Ferdinand. In Spain, as in England, there was also a lull in the actual fighting between the king and his enemies, but no end to the scheming and plotting among the contentious nobles of Castile. Enrique, or Henry the King, and the lords who supported him and his daughter Juana were waiting for any excuse to take up arms against the Archbishop of Toledo and those nobles who supported Isabella. On September 9th, 1468, however, a truce had been signed because Isabella insisted upon it. Even though the overzealous Parisians wanted to keep on fighting to the finish in her behalf, she insisted on making peace with her half-brother Enrique. Enrique, not at all sure he might not be thrown from his throne, as his straw image had been hurled to the ground at Avila, was ready to make almost any concession, so long as he was assured of being king for as long as he lived. This was granted, but the terms imposed on him were so humiliating that it is difficult to believe anyone expected him to keep them. He was forced to divorce his wife and send her home to her brother Alfonso, the King of Portugal. He had to declare their daughter Juana illegitimate, set aside any claim for her, and declare his half-sister Isabella his legitimate heir to the throne. He also had to agree that Isabella was not to be married against her will, but might choose her own husband, subject to his approval and the consent of the nobles of the realm. Choosing a husband for Isabella had been going on for years. When she was 10, Enrique had selected one who was 40 years old, Prince Carlos of Aragon. Prince Carlos had died suddenly, probably of poison. This was due, many believed, to the ambition of his scheming stepmother, the Queen of Aragon, who had her own 9-year-old son, Fernando, or Ferdinand, in mind for Isabella. Enrique did not favor Ferdinand. Enrique's next choice was his brother-in-law, Juana's uncle, King Alfonso of Portugal. Alfonso was the nephew of Prince Henry the Navigator, who had gained the title of El Africano for his bravery in fighting the Moors in North Africa. Alfonso was a widower with a son, John, almost as old as Isabella. But what of that? Enrique intended that Isabella should marry him, and regarded the matter as settled. Alfonso, equally confident and elated by the prospect, sent a magnificent embassy headed by the Archbishop of Lisbon to arrange a betrothal. The princess flatly refused to consider it. An infanta of Castile cannot be disposed of in marriage without the consent of the nobles of the realm, said Isabella, knowing that there were many nobles who would not consent. Most important among them was the Archbishop of Toledo. Ferdinand of Aragon was the Archbishop's choice. Isabella had liked what she had heard about Ferdinand. A messenger whom she had sent secretly to Aragon to see him reported that the prince was a very proper man with a comely visage and a brave spirit. Enrique was so enraged at Isabella for refusing to marry Alfonso that he threatened to imprison her in the fortress at Madrid until she consented. But the common people sided with the princess. They paraded the streets with banners of Aragon and sang songs contrasting the widower of Portugal with the young Prince of Aragon. All this was before Enrique had been forced to make peace with Isabella. As heir to the throne, she instantly became more valuable property, and suitors popped up in every country. Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, brother of King Edward of England, was one of them. Richard, who was just the age of Ferdinand, offered to come live in Castile if Isabella would have him as her royal husband. The King of France, Louis XI, proposed his brother the Duke, sending as his ambassador a French cardinal famous for his oratory. Isabella was ready for him. She knew all about the French candidate. The same messenger she had sent to Aragon had also gone secretly to France. He reported that the Duke was weak and feeble, with watery eyes and limbs so skinny as to be almost deformed. Isabella listened politely, however, while the cardinal praised the Duke as the very model of charm and grace. Then she dismissed France with the same firm, legitimate excuse that she had given Portugal. Having made her decision, Isabella sent another secret messenger to the King of Aragon to arrange a betrothal with Ferdinand. The marriage contract was signed near Barcelona on the 7th of January, 1469. Isabella had then gone to stay with her mother in Madrigal. Soon she learned that Enrique had sent word that any help given to Isabella would be punished as treason, followed shortly by orders for her to be seized by force and taken into custody. Somehow the determined girl managed to get word to her good friend, the Archbishop of Toledo. He hastened to the rescue and carried Isabella off to the loyal city of Valladolid. From there, messengers were sent to Ferdinand, bidding him to come at once or all would be lost. The moment word came from Isabella, Ferdinand was ready to start. This marriage was his chance to get his hands on the throne of Castile, a much larger kingdom than that of Aragon. He did not mean to lose this chance, nor did his royal parents, who had struggled to bring about the marriage. In a matter of days, plans were complete for his departure. Secrecy was all important, since the border was being guarded. 6 knights, disguised as traders, went with the prince. Ferdinand was dressed as their servant, sleeping in the stable with the mules at each inn where they spent the night. On October 15th, travel-stained and dirty, but safe, he was near enough to Valladolid to send word to Isabella. At midnight there came a pounding on the castle door. The massive door swung open in the torchlight to reveal the prince and 4 servants. "It is he!" cried one of the courtiers. The Archbishop of Toledo, roused from his bed to welcome the young man, suggested that he wait until morning to see Isabella. The impatient prince brushed the suggestion aside. So Isabella was awakened, hastily dressed, and saw for the first time the young man she had heard and thought so much about. There he stood, Ferdinand of Aragon, a sturdy young man with a swarthy face and brown hair, not quite so tall as she. This was to be the husband she had chosen for herself, and to whom she was to be a devoted wife for the rest of her life. On October 19th, 1469, the Archbishop of Toledo performed the marriage ceremony of Ferdinand and Isabella, uniting Aragon and Castile, the first step towards a united Spain. Ferdinand was 17, Isabella 18. The year that Isabella was married, Christopher Columbus was also 18 years old. That year, 1469, or the next, it is believed that he made his first real voyage on an armed galley owned by his native city of Genoa. Genoa owned so many of these armed galleys that foreign rulers often engaged both the ships and the brave Genoese soldiers to fight their battles for them. It was on such a mission that Columbus was enlisted. "It happened to me," he wrote later when he had become an admiral, "that King René, whom God hath taken, sent me to Tunis to capture the galley Fernandina." This sounds as though Columbus had been the captain, which of course was impossible. King René was actually the Duke of Anjou, ruler of Provence. René often chartered Genoese galleys to defend Provence against the Moorish pirates of North Africa. In 1469 he was at war with the King of Aragon. Therefore, as the galleys to be captured was named the Fernandina, it most surely belonged to the King of Aragon, whose son Ferdinand had just married the future friend of Columbus, the Princess Isabella. René was the father of the former Queen Marguerite of England. After the death of her husband and son, her ransom of 50,000 crowns had been paid by Louis XI, and Marguerite had gone home to Provence. In return for all the help he had given her, the wily spider demanded that she give up her rights to the inheritance of her father. So that was how Provence was added to Louis XI's ever-growing nation of France. Florence, Italy. One fine day in June 1469, just 4 months before the simple wedding of Ferdinand and Isabella, for which they themselves had to borrow money, a more costly and elaborate wedding had taken place in Florence. The whole city was decorated. Every street, shop, and gateway was bright with flags and banners for the wedding of Lorenzo de' Medici. The bride, Clarice Orsini of Rome, had been carefully chosen by Lorenzo's parents. As his father, Piero, was far from well, Lorenzo's mother had gone to Rome to look closely at the girl before they signed the final contract. She had written her husband that she could see no fault in the young lady, save shyness, and that she does not carry her head as proudly as our girls do, but pokes it forward a little. Young Lorenzo did not care at all how Clarice carried her head or what she looked like. If she suited his parents, he would marry her. He could not be bothered to think about her. He was much too busy having a fun time with his brother, their friends, and all the pretty girls of Florence, especially his sweetheart, darling Lucrezia Donati. Since December, when he had been married by proxy in Rome, Lorenzo's mother-in-law, the Countess Orsini, had been urging him to come to Rome and honor them with a visit. He had to keep thinking up excuses why he could not get away. The tournament in February was far too gay and exciting to miss. He had worn the colors of Lucrezia, and she had crowned him with the chaplets of violets. Every month, every week, every day, there was something too joyful to lose in thinking about the future. Lorenzo put his happy thinking into verse. Dance and play, in the future come what may. Youths and maids enjoy today. Not ye know about tomorrow. Fair is youth and void of sorrow. Keep perpetual holiday. So, in perpetual holiday, 6 months rolled by, and Lorenzo did not get to Rome before Clarice Orsini, who was prim and proud and rather dull, arrived in Florence for the wedding. Though she did not approve of unbridled hilarity, she was pleased to be the center of proper wedding festivities. For days handsome gifts had been pouring into the Medici palace. Wagon loads of produce had been coming in from the country, meats, wines, vegetables, fruits, and sweets to be distributed among the common people when the feasting began. There were 5 formal banquets for the invited guests, at which tons of sugar plums and hundreds of casks of wine were consumed. Clarice sat among the young ladies. Lorenzo dined with the young men. The older people sat apart where they could hear and watch the music and the dancing. The ceremony started off with an exhibition of dancing in front of the Medici palace, after which an olive tree, symbol of a peaceful marriage, was hoisted into an upper window, with many cheers and good wishes. Lorenzo's wedding mass was celebrated in the Medici church of San Lorenzo. 6 months later, friends and relatives returned for the funeral services of Lorenzo's father, Piero, who died on December 3rd, 1469. During Piero's last illness, everyone had been worried about the future government of Florence. Everyone, that is, except young Lorenzo, the future ruler. Aside from the grief of seeing his father suffer and die, Lorenzo was composed and self-confident. To his great good fortune, a powerful kinsman, Tommaso Soderini, who had been urged to assume control, remained loyal to Lorenzo and persuaded the heads of the powerful Florentine families to follow his lead. The second day after my father's funeral, Lorenzo wrote, the principal men of the city and of the state came to our house to console us with our loss and to encourage me to take charge of the city and state as my father and grandfather had done. I consented to it unwillingly, but I did so in order to protect our friends and our property, for it fares ill in Florence with anyone who possesses wealth without any control in the government. Lorenzo might have been unwilling at first because he hated to use the time for work that could have been happily spent in writing poetry, discussing Plato, visiting painters and sculptor studios, hunting and horse racing, or just dancing and singing songs. But Lorenzo wanted everything that life had to offer, and that included power. Lorenzo loved power, and he showed at once that he knew how to handle it and how to keep it. The new ruler of a government must make his position secure within the first 4 days, he said, and proceeded to do so. First, he called in his most powerful rivals for conferences and overwhelmed them with honors, sending one or more of them on some very special mission to a faraway court. This got them out of Florence, and also increased the reputation of his government at those foreign courts. Though he often traveled himself, he always returned to Florence to supervise the drawing of names for the signoria. The signoria, or council, was made up of 8 tradesmen and merchants, and was changed every 2 months. At every inauguration he gave a speech of welcome to the magnificent and illustrious newly elected members, and a celebration in their honor of horse races and dancing on the piazza. As for the average workmen of Florence, Lorenzo did not believe, as Plato did, that they were interested in government, unless it interfered with their happiness. So he planned more amusements for them, and better ones, even though many friends told him that the common people only wanted coarse, rough slapstick and horseplay. He believed that they would appreciate and respond to something better. Every feast day he gave them beautiful pageants and tournaments. For months ahead he had artists designing elaborate floats and costumes, and poets writing verses and composing music to be sung. Beautiful girls posing as Venus rode in chariots or on the backs of horses dressed in the skins of lions and tigers, led by Hercules or Apollo, and accompanied by groups of singers and dancers. It was like a festival in ancient Athens the Golden Age brought to life again in Florence. That is how Lorenzo thought of Florence, as the center of a golden age, a light-hearted city of art, learning, love, and laughter. For one of the tournaments he took as his motto, "The time returns," as spring returns after a long winter. Botticelli expressed the idea in a famous painting made for Lorenzo, called the Primavera, or Return of Spring. Botticelli had just opened his own studio and was seeing much of Verrocchio's former pupil, Leonardo da Vinci, whose name was enrolled for the first time in the year 1472 in the famous Red Book listing the painters of Florence. That year also, an Italian goldsmith brought into Florence a strange little machine from Germany for making books. He cast his own type, set up shop, but printed only one book. No one in Florence, certainly not Lorenzo, had any use for an ugly book made by machine. He took pride in his beautiful hand-lettered illuminated books. They were works of art on which he spent thousands of ducats a year. If everyone could get books for little or nothing, what would books be worth? And if the books were printed by machine, what would copyists, scribers, illuminators do for a living? They would be out of work. Oh no, Lorenzo was not interested in this machine for turning out inferior books, made among the barbarians of some backwoods German city.